Thanks for coming. Nice to see you again. Um, as Elizabeth mentioned, there's some resources available for you on Google Classroom, and some of that is a response to requests that you all made last week. So there are some links to some short films, for example, the one I mentioned, and then a couple of other ones as well. And these are ones that I've um, to a greater or lesser extent successfully taught in the past too. So they've been vetted at least a few times. Um, and so what I thought I would do is go back to the end of the slideshow that I was using last week, because at the end of that, on the last couple slides, I have some lists of Native American authors that I wanted to share with you and just go over very, very briefly. And then just to give you a sense of how I was conceiving of this evening's session, I thought I would model for you the way I teach one of the texts that I recommended, Gertrude Bonen's American Indian Stories. So when I teach this, I provide a kind of big picture historical context. Um, and use that to help the students get a sense of the world in which Bonin lived and the world in which Bonin went to one of the boarding schools, an experience about which she writes in American Indian Stories. And then I suggested, if you had the time, to take a look at two of the short stories that I had recommended, Eddie Chukalate's Galveston Bay, 1826. I chose that for obvious reasons. We are in Texas after all. Well, Elizabeth isn't in Texas, at least right at the moment, but we're in Texas after all. So I thought I'd try to find a Texas-based story by a native writer. And then The Man to Send Rain Clouds by Leslie Marmon Silko, writing under another name, Leslie Chapman. And so these are two short stories that, again, I've taught previously, and students tend to respond to them really well. So I thought we'd go through those with appropriate pauses to see if you all have questions or comments. I'm happy to have conversations about these works as well, if you'd like to do that too. So we'll just see how it goes. I will switch over to the slideshow um, from last week first. And do this. You're able to see it, correct? The most frequently taught Native American writers? Okay. Okay. So a self-explanatory title, of course. I wanted to give you, a sense of the Native American authors that I've seen taught most frequently over the last 20 years or so that I've been teaching Native American literature. The names do change over the years. For example, the last author on that list is Tommy Orange, and he's somebody who, as of 5 years ago, hadn't published anything yet. But he published a celebrated and uh, well-reviewed, rapturously reviewed novel called There, There, about an urban Native population in Oakland, California. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to give you this list is that, we don't have time to cover, individual texts by all of them. So, this is a list that you can keep on hand, and you can look up what they've published over the years and find texts on your own. Though in this slideshow, I've tried to suggest specific texts for most of them, and I'll continue to keep this list in mind today as well. So I'm looking at Louise Erdrich now, who just published, I don't know, she's published 20 something novels. Another one of hers just came out about a month ago. I haven't had time to read it yet, but you might have seen news or early reviews of that novel recently. And then I thought I would also provide you with a list of what I thought, at least when I put this list together a couple weeks ago, are the most teachable works by native authors. Um, and again, after I go through this list, I'll pause for just a minute to see if anyone has specific questions about any of these. Um, Most of them are available online, including the more recent poems that are still in copyright, but there's so many websites uh, for poets that if you Google the author and title of the poem, you should be able to find them. So the earliest text on here is William Apes's "An Indian's Looking Glass for the White Man." It's a short, maybe 8 to 10 page statement about really about racism in the 1830s in the United States, of course. And his thesis is that racism is incompatible with Christianity. He was a minister in addition to being Native American. Gertrude Bonan's Zitkala Shah, a text we're going to talk about in some detail today. I should note that I put 2 names there because Gertrude Bonan is her birth name. Zitkala Shah is her pen name, and Zitkala Shah is Lakota. It means Redbird. And so I'll just give both of those names because you can find information about her under both. Charles Alexander Eastman, I'm going to mention him later as well because he was one of the early students at the boarding schools, just like Gertrude Bonan was. Darcy McNichol, Train Time. This is a short story set at a train station, not surprisingly, based on the title, where there's a group of Native children waiting to get on the train to go to a boarding school. Ruth Muskrat Bronson's Indians Are People Too, and Scott Momaday's The Way to Rainy Mountain, which at least one person last week said they were familiar with, and I think even had taught as well. A couple Joy Harjo poems. She has so many wonderful ones; it's hard to go wrong there. These are just 2 that I like to teach. And then Leslie Marmon Silko, The Man to Send Rain Clouds, which we'll talk about again in detail. And then I think last week it was Erica who asked, for suggestions for nonfiction. And maybe that's something we can talk about in greater detail at some point this evening. But the essay here by Silko, it's a work of nonfiction. It's an essay about her perspective on language and literature from what she calls a Pueblo Indian perspective. It's a really, really teachable essay because she just talks about the differences between English and the indigenous between English and the indigenous language spoken at her home pueblo, the Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico, and just the different ways those languages structure a reality. And so it's very easy to follow and really compelling as well. Louise Erdrich, Dear John Wayne. We started the session last week with 2 stanzas from that poem, and then Indian Boarding Schools, The Runaways. This is it seems the enduring theme of my presentations. Sherman Alexie's short story, This Is What It Means to Say Phoenix, Arizona, from the short story collection, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven. And then How to Write the Great American Indian Novel, one of his one of his many great poems. One of the reasons that I would suggest This Is What It Means to Say Phoenix, Arizona, is because it's the origin of the film Smoke Signals, which is a film, if you had time, you could show to your students. I think it's appropriate for a high school audience, and is a very funny and very poignant take on life on the Spokane Reservation, which is Alexie's home reservation. Beth Piatote, this is a short story called Fish Wars. She's an author who, as of about 5 years ago, there wouldn't have been anything for you to read, but she has started publishing short stories. And at the end of this particular collection, The Beadworkers, she actually has a play that's based on Antigone. So she has taken the structure of the play Antigone and adopted it for a Nez Perce context. I'm not recommending the play. It's a bit of a challenge. Fish Wars, though, is about a young Native girl whose parents are involved in the protests about fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest in the 1970s. So again, a story that teaches really well. So that's the top 15. And then here are a couple others that I would suggest, including one we'll talk about today, the Eddie Chocolate Galveston's Bay 1826 story. But here are a couple other ones. And I've only taught one of these actually, but I would like to teach these, and I think that they would work really well. Larissa Fasthorse came out with a play in 2018 called The Thanksgiving Play, and it's about four actors who all teachers who have received grants to do a Thanksgiving play, and it goes hysterically wrong. It goes hysterically wrong, I have to tell you. It was so popular that it eventually had a short run on Broadway. And so she's now one of three Native authors who have had a play produced at a Broadway theater, actually. So the play is appropriate for high school audiences, and I think high school students would really like it. I've taught comics now just one time, and I can't tell you how I can't put in words how well it went. The students were so excited to have something just a little bit different. This is the one that I taught, the Indigenous Comics collection. There are 3 volumes. I just have to pick the second one. They're really short comics about cultural or political issues in very, very distinct Native communities. That's what's so great about the comics, is so they're very specific. They draw you into a very specific Indigenous world. And there are even a few that are more kind of science fiction, fantasy-like as well. And maybe your students are the same way, but mine appear to have grown up reading a lot of genre fiction, and they like to see it represented in the classroom, at least a little bit. So that went well. Angela Booley's The Firekeeper's Daughter. This is a YA novel that some of my colleagues have taught pretty successfully too. Andrea Rogers. This is a very new book by a Cherokee writer called Man-Made Monsters, and it's all genre fiction. There's a vampire story in there. There's a werewolf story in there. There's an aliens living in my swimming pool in there. And they're all very specifically Cherokee, including a couple of them that are set in Texas too. So I suspect that would teach well. And then Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a book that has now been turned into an edition for young adults, actually. And so I think that when it comes to nonfiction, Erica, if I'm remembering again correctly, that you're the one to ask about that might be a book, that you would teach, and maybe in parts, right? Not the whole thing, but some sections of it. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. Okay. And then and pause before getting started on what I hope we could focus on for this evening. So I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions about any of those selections, or why specifically I chose those texts as opposed to other ones, or anything like that. And if there aren't any questions, I can jump right back into it. Yes, the chat would be fine to use. So, okay. Okay, no questions, I think. So let me go back to the go back to sharing. And oh, this is going to take just a second. Hang on. I lost track of I have too many windows open. Hang on 1 second, please. All right, there we go. I think I'm ready now. All right, can everybody see the photograph of Little Crow? Yes, good. Thank you, Shauna. I see your thumb up. Thank you. I appreciate it. Um, so, so here, just for full transparency, here's what I'm doing. So this is an introductory lecture. I'll do the short version of it, but it's an introductory lecture to teaching American Indian stories by Gertrude Bonin or Zitkala Shah. And so one of the things that I want my students to take away from this particular lesson is how the boarding schools became part of a federal policy of assimilation in the first place, right? Like how did this happen that from 1879 to 1934, this was the official policy of the federal government, that is to assimilate Native children. And so the roots of the boarding schools reside in all the warfare on the Great Plains, in the Southwest and in the Pacific Northwest too, but mostly on the Great Plains. After from the 1850s, really through the 1880s up to about 1890. And so during this period, there was nearly constant warfare on the plains. And so this was unsustainable. Of course, constant warfare is unsustainable. It even did not stop during the Civil War. So during the Civil War, there were these small local wars between the Union Army and indigenous peoples in various parts of the country too. So it was very expensive to wage war. It was very difficult to sell it to increasingly skeptical citizens of the US, particularly in the East. So there was opposition to it as a policy. And the groups of immigrants moving their way west, were also increasingly unwilling to move into war zones. So now you'll notice that I didn't say that there were, sustained strong objections to actually attacking and killing Native people, right? Like there were some, but for the most part, the people making these decisions were thinking about it as policy, right, rather than as morality, right? Like, what's the policy of the U.S. government going to be to the various groups of indigenous people in the West? So, what I try to do in this particular lecture is to focus on a set of wars that can be easily connected to Native writers, right? So, I mean, there are plenty to choose from, but I chose ones that would allow you as a teacher, and you're welcome to use these in this very form. You don't even have to change them. You could use these, so you can sort of show a history, and by doing so, establish a context for the writing that comes out of it. So, for example, in the early 1860s, there was an event that's known as the Great Sioux Uprising. And this was in southern Minnesota, and it involved local Native people, primarily Dakotas, objecting to the loss of land and the violation of treaties they had signed to protect that land, and they wanted their land and their fields back. And so, under this particular indigenous leader, Little Crow, they fought back, um, and as was often the case, it did not end well for Little Crow and his people. He was actually not himself not captured after the war, but his wife and two children were. There's a photo of them there at Fort Snelling, which is where they were held after the war. What's interesting about this war literarily is that Charles Alexander Eastman, who went on to become one of the first Indigenous people to earn a medical degree, and who became a prolific writer and a really wonderful writer, his father and other family members had to flee this particular military conflict. And so part of his earliest memories are as a war refugee. And this comes into play in certain works of in certain works that he published later in his life when he was looking back on his childhood years. This particular conflict, again, this is happening during the Civil War, ended with the execution of 38 Dakotas by hanging at Mankato, Minnesota. It's the largest mass execution in U.S. history. And this is very much a surprise, I think, to most of my students, because the president at the time was Abraham Lincoln. He's widely considered to be one of our greatest presidents for obvious reasons I'm sure I do not need to restate. In fact, I'm from Springfield, Illinois, the town that claims Lincoln, right? Even though he had other hometowns. But so I grew up, absolutely saturated by Abraham Lincoln worship. But he actually allowed these executions to go forward. So Eastman became separated from his father eventually. During the war, his father eventually was arrested. His sentence was commuted by Abraham Lincoln. He was incarcerated in prison. And when he was released, he went to track down Alexander Eastman, and he actually encouraged Eastman to go to the boarding schools. In fact, perhaps not a necessarily surprising recommendation, because the other option was to stay in a very tumultuous world that might become a war zone again. And there were quite a few Native parents, grandparents, and other relatives making this decision at this time. I'll go through these next couple a little bit more quickly, but just to give you an example of the breadth of the warfare during this particular time. This is also in the 1860s, when under Kit Carson, the U.S. was at war with Navajos, and forced thousands of them to walk from their homeland to a place called Bosque Redondo. This is called the Long Walk. It's a little bit evocative of the Trail of Tears, actually, but it's just another example of a war ending in a kind of mass exile, even though Navajos eventually, those that survived, eventually returned to their homeland. Another example from the 1860s, this is Black Kettle. He led a group of Cheyennes and Arapahoes. Again, this is the 1860s, 1864. They were, I think I mentioned them last week, in fact. they were flying an American flag over their camp to indicate that they had signed a peace treaty with the United States. But a militia led by a man named John Chivington marched out of Denver and attacked Black Kettle's camp. This is at Sand Creek. And I mentioned this particular historical moment because later in the lesson I teach from Simon Ortiz's From Sand Creek. So I want them to get a sense of what happened. I'm giving you the very, very short version. There were all kinds of other things happening at this moment in this part of the country. But eventually, though Black Kettle and his wife and others survived Sand Creek, they were later killed at another attack, this at Ouachita, 4 years later in 1868. It was by the mid 1870s. So you have Minnesota, I've given you examples. I've given you New Mexico, Colorado, and as examples of places where this is happening. And eventually some government leaders and military leaders decided that a different approach needed to be taken. And this is where we get the origins of the shift from military conflict and the signing of treaties to assimilation as the primary way of dealing with the conflict between European immigrants and Native Americans. This is a picture of Apache prisoners. If you look third from the right in the lower first row, you'll see one of the most famous Native leaders in history, Geronimo. He was taken prisoner along with these Apaches and Native people from a variety of other groups, Kiowas, Cheyennes, Arapahoes, and so on. And they were taken through Texas to Fort Marion in Florida, where they were incarcerated under Richard Henry Pratt. And it was at this moment that Pratt devised, a program, I'm not sure what else to call it, devised a program to teach Indigenous people to live like white people. And so one of the things that he did was he dressed the prisoners like sort of like soldiers here. This is not exactly military dress, but it's close. And so he dresses them, he teaches them English, he teaches them various domestic arts as well, all in an effort to show them how, this is how Pratt would put it, okay? So these are not my words. To show them how white people lived, white men lived in particular. It was so successful, Pratt thought, that he proposed this system for schools run by the federal government. He thought it had worked on these seasoned, hardened Indigenous warriors. And he also thought that it might work on children. This is a pause in my presentation because I always want to mention the ledger drawings. These are drawings that Native prisoners did. They are part of the very little Indigenous record of this particular experience at Fort Marion. And they often were drawing pictures of battles they'd been in, or when they went out to steal horses, or scenes with their families and that sort of thing. And it has become a significant Indigenous art tradition. So modern Native artists do what's called ledger art. And I've given you one example of that at the bottom. This is a Spokane artist named George Flett. And he's painted some dancers on a page from the Congressional Record, and he's painted them in the ledger art style. I mention that because I want to convey to my students that Indigenous people went on the record, in this case artistically, about their lives and their experiences. And it's a fantastic research project for students, both to look up the historical examples of ledger art that have their origin here at Fort Marion, and then to look at the contemporary examples as well. So Pratt proposes to the federal government a boarding school that would be run kind of like a military school for Native kids. The federal government said this sounds like a fantastic idea. And within 4 years after those prisoners were taken to Fort Marion, he had opened Carlisle, which is the first and the most famous of the Indian boarding schools. There's a picture of the enormous first class with the girls in the front and the boys in the back. When the students arrived at the schools, all their belongings and clothes were taken and destroyed. Their hair was cut. They were dressed in these kind of pseudo-military uniforms that you see them wearing here. And they were forbidden to speak their native languages. And this was the case whether they were 8 or 9 or 12 or 13 or 15 or 16 years old. So there were kids of all those ages. One of the first students at Carlisle was a man called Luther Standing Bear. He's another Native writer that I haven't recommended him to you as someone you could teach, but you absolutely could. He wrote 3 books. Most of them are about his childhood on the Great Plains with his particular band of the Lakotas. He also became a movie star as well in Hollywood, acting in silent westerns too. There he is with his father too. Here's Pratt with a couple of the students from Carlisle too. One of the ways that Pratt promoted the schools was with before and after pictures. These are photographs, I'll show you the next one in just a second, that often produce gasps from my students. So the photo I'm going to show you next is the same person, but it's the same person after he has gone through the introduction to Carlisle and the early stages of the assimilation process. So this is Tom Torlino. He's Navajo. He arrived at Carlisle in the 1880s, and this is him afterwards as well. It's pretty poignant visual evidence of what was happening to the students at the schools. I'll show you a couple more of these. I won't linger on them, but here's another example of them. These are all staged photos, of course. This is before their clothes and cultural and religious items were taken from them. Here's another of three girls. One identified as Sioux, Arikara, and Gros Ventre. And then that's them 14 months later as well. So this didn't mean that warfare ended on the Great Plains. It continued, but ended for the most part in 1890 on the Pine Ridge Reservation at a place called Wounded Knee Creek. It's a historical episode that I think most people are familiar with. There's photographic evidence of it. I won't linger on this too. Here's a picture of the members of the 7th Cavalry, the reconstituted 7th Cavalry. Remember, it was decimated at Little Bighorn. It was reconstituted, and it participated in this particular attack at Wounded Knee too. And this circles back to the boarding schools because there was a little girl who survived the attack, while her family didn't, including her parents, and she was adopted by one of the soldiers who was involved in the attack, and her community named her Little Lost Bird, Zinkalanuni, Little Lost Bird, and this became the name used for kids who had gone to boarding schools, lost birds. So in the decades that followed, and kids continued to go to the boarding schools, and then they would return or sometimes not return. Their home communities started to call them lost birds. And so that, I hope, like sort of closes the circle on the way that warfare on the Great Plains led to the boarding schools, and then sort of reconnects, here at the in 1890, at this moment that the ghost dancers were killed at Wounded Knee. And Gertrude Bonnen lives through a lot of this. She was born in 1876, the nation's centennial, also the year of Little Bighorn, too. And then she went to the boarding schools herself, and then produced a really wonderful work on that particular experience at the boarding school, called American Indian Stories. So I'm going to stop there too, and see if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share. Again, like Elizabeth said previously, you can do it in the chat, or you can unmute and ask if you would like. And I actually don't have the chat open, so if you ask in
I've got it open. Cynthia asked, were the boarding schools run by religious groups like Catholics?
This is it's a really great question. There was an agreement between the federal government and various religious groups to run the schools, and each one was a little different. But yes, some of them, many of them, in fact, were run, by people from various Protestant denominations, Catholics, as well. So, yeah.
We also had a question from Erica. Do we have an estimate about how many people went through the boarding schools?
Also a very good question. There probably is one out there. I don't know what it is. It's something that I would have to look up myself. Their record keeping wasn't great, so I would be suspicious of any estimate, to tell you the truth. We do know that, from 1879 to 1934, that thousands of Native kids went through the schools, right? So we know that. But the experience for many of them at the schools was very brief. Many students got sick pretty quickly and died. Many students ran away. And so I just think it would be really difficult to estimate how many students in total there were. Plus, after 1934, there were still what we think of as boarding schools, right? Just not run under the federal government. There were day schools, there were mission schools, right? Like all these other kinds of schools. So it would kind of depend, how you defined the school, the schools that you're thinking about, right? So you might, I mean, if you search right now and just said the federal boarding schools, there might be an estimate that would be more or less accurate, I suppose. So, yeah.
And
Are
then
there other?
we had a third question from Lucero. I teach early American literature. Can you suggest any oratory before the Civil War?
Oh, you know what? There's a really great book called Native American Testimony. And let's see. I think it's I'm gonna have to look it up because I think it's Peter Mathiasen is the editor. Let me see. I'm looking it up on my phone so I don't mess with my screen here. I think it's Peter Mathiasen.
Peter Nabokov?
No, thank you. I got the first name right, but not the second. Thank you very much for looking that up. Yeah, A Chronicle of Indian White Relations from Prophecy to the Present, 1492 to 2000. So that would be, it's a slightly older text. And then there's another another one that I will just look up for you. I'm going to say the title and it's going to be slightly wrong, but it's something like Great Documents in American Indian History, and it has speeches in them, like you were asking about, right? Like oratory. So I'll make sure to get that title exactly right, instead of kind of spitballing it like I just did. Okay.
And that's it for the questions we have in the chat right now.
Fantastic. Okay, very good. Thank you for those. Um, for American Indian stories, and again, I'm happy with the time that we have to have a conversation about it, or happy just to tell you here's how I would do it after I would have presented a kind of longer version of that historical context than I gave you. Um, but for American Indian stories, one of the reasons that I think it teaches so well, and I should say I've actually taught it to high schoolers too, as well. So um, one of the reasons I think it teaches so well is because of the way that she so clearly structures it. So there are three sections to it. The first section has 7 parts or 7 chapters. The second section has 7 parts or 7 chapters, and then the final part has 4 chapters in it. And so the first 7 sections um, are all about her childhood leading up to the time that she goes to the boarding school. And I present these chapters uh, to my students as a representation of Dakota education. So this is a kind of education that isn't institutional. It's the kind of education where all of the older members of the community are the teachers. So it's not just Bonan's mother, but it's some older neighbors that sometimes come over for dinner and tell stories. It's about some of the, some of her extended family members, two, an aunt in particular, and each of the chapters, each of those 7 chapters, has at least one and sometimes 2 or 3 lessons in it about what it means to be a good Dakota. So, for example, in the legends, that's the second chapter, um, uh, Bonin is listening to some much older members of her community telling stories. And they're telling stories that are teaching her something about the world and about her life and what her life might be like as a Dakota. In the fourth chapter, which is called Coffee Making, um, those older members come over again. And by observation, Bonin has come to understand that one of the key Dakota cultural values is hospitality. So she serves um, this um, she serves them, these older members of her community, cold coffee and cold bread. And her mom then comes back, and they're kind of laughing amongst themselves about what she's done. She didn't heat the coffee up, right? She didn't heat the bread up. She just was like, "Oh, it's here on the fire. Here, I'll give it to you." Um, and none of them scold her because she had fulfilled a Dakota obligation to welcome guests. And that's what was important, right? Is that she had recognized that as something that she was required as a host. And so it's a short anecdote that's funny, but also conveys a sense of what was really important to Dakotas. In one of the other chapters, um, they are on their way to a celebration. Some young men have just come back from their first battle, and they're being celebrated. And her mother makes a meal for an older member of the community that can't cook for herself. And as a little girl, Bonin says, "Oh, I want to go to the ceremony. I want to go there." And her mother tells her that it's more important that they take care of this other family member. I mean, I'm sorry, other community member, right? So, so what we do is in our conversations we talk about the specific Dakota values that the stories convey. And then the second set of stories is about her time at the boarding school. Um, and and so that is an example of a non-Dakota or non-Indigenous institutionalized kind of education. And it obviously is much different than the experiences she had as a young girl in the Dakota world. So, one of the most explicit lessons in the first set of chapters is in the beadwork section, when her mom is actually teaching her how to do beadwork. And she keeps choosing really difficult patterns instead of the more basic conventional Dakota patterns. And her mom keeps making her finish what she starts until she learns to do the easier ones, until she learns there's a reason that the conventional ones are the easier ones, like little crosses and shapes and that sort of thing that are just easier to do if you're beading. Um, but her mom, lets her keep making the same mistake over and over and over again until she learns, right? She never makes her do something, right? From late 19th century Dakota perspective, that's a better way to teach kids. You go to the boarding schools and, just to not to be too blunt about it, right? It's a much more regimented kind of educational system. Their days are controlled by the bells that the school rings, so that they come, to breakfast, and the bells for class, and the bells for lunch, and the bells to go to classes again, and the bells for the other things that they do. And their praying is a part of it. That's the religious aspect of the school that she went to. She isn't used to it, so she doesn't know that that's what you're supposed to be doing. The kids get punished for things they don't know, because how could they possibly know that you aren't supposed to do certain things? They don't speak English, and the rules are so omnipresent, and there's so many of them. It's impossible for, or next to impossible for someone like an 8-year-old Gertrude Bonin to understand what they're supposed to be doing. So there's a scene in the snow episode in particular where she and her friends get punished, and they're trying to figure out how not to be punished, because they don't understand why they're being punished, and two, they don't understand what the person who wants to punish them is saying to them, and so they just keep guessing whether they're supposed to say yes or no to the questions that they're getting. And they keep telling each other, say no this time or say yes this time, and eventually one of them gets it right, and the question is asked in such a way that the answer no is appropriate, or the answer yes, I can't remember exactly which one it is, but and so with these symmetrical sections, you get Dakota education, and you get a kind of non-Dakota boarding school education, and the differences are so dramatic that the students will see them themselves and want to talk about them. They might want to talk about their own educational experiences. You always have to be prepared for that when you teach this. But I think that's one of the reasons that they like it and like to talk about it, is they know what it's like to be a student, and maybe feel like they have to do things that they don't particularly want to do. And then the last 4 chapters focus on what happens after she leaves the boarding school and actually gets asked to be a teacher at Carlisle. So if you had the chance to read this, when a gentleman comes into her room and says, "I'm going to send you to the West to recruit students for the boarding schools," that's Pratt. That's Richard Henry Pratt, the person who created Carlisle, and where Bonin worked very briefly until she published these essays. after which she did not work there anymore, probably for obvious reasons. Um, Pratt expected his former students to sing the praises of the school, and Bonin did not. So, and again, this just to um, say this for the second or maybe the third time, remember that Bonin was just like Charles Alexander Eastman, just like Luther Standing Bear. They're all three from the same part of the country. They're all Dakota or Lakota. They're all from the upper Midwest and the upper Great Plains. They're all war refugees, really. And so at this particular moment in time for them, there were two options, really. Stay in a war zone or go to one of these schools. Those were the choices. At least that's how I always present it to my own students. So, are there questions in the chat, Elizabeth or Emily?
There was a conversation about when the boarding schools have closed and if some of them were closing as late as 2020 and whether that had an impact on, or whether COVID had an impact on those closures.
So the most of the boarding schools, the ones that I'm describing, did not last much beyond the 1920s. And then in 1934, the federal government ended assimilation as official federal policy, in an act called the Indian Reorganization Act, and that act was supposed to return control of the education of Native students to Native communities. It did not exactly do that, and there were still schools existed, that in this case still continued the federal boarding school model, but also mission schools as well, church-run schools, I should say. They're not always mission schools exactly, but church-run schools. So there were still schools. Some of them weren't boarding schools, but they were day schools. And so it wasn't as if control over the education of Native kids returned to Native parents. It really didn't. There wasn't a structure in place to do that. So Native kids were still going to schools where all of the teachers were not Native, and where many of the teachers had the same perspective on Indigenous people and Indigenous culture that the teachers at the boarding schools had. That is that that I don't know. There's no way to put this delicately, right? That Native culture was inferior, that Native religious beliefs were inferior, that Native languages were inferior, et cetera, and that their education should proceed following the motto of Richard Henry Pratt, which was to kill the Indian and save the man. That's how Pratt put it in the motto for Carlisle. So there's a short book of poetry and short fiction by Laura Tohe, a Navajo writer, called No Parole Today. I've taught it as well, and it's about life at one of those day schools. I can put that in the chat there. Let's see. No Parole Today by Laura Tohe. And so, if you were going to do a lesson on the boarding schools, there's enough literature out there that you could do it, right? Like you could do a 3-week lesson on the boarding schools, and go to the link to Carlisle that I shared with you. It's in Google Classroom, and have your students look through the student records and some of the student publications from there and so on. You could do No Parole Today. And you, along with your students, would be able to see the links, between the federal boarding schools I just described and some of the schools that continued and remained controlled by non-Native people near and sometimes even in Native communities too. So, yeah. They were called residential schools in Canada. You've probably heard this. It's the same thing pretty much, right? So, I mean, And maybe you on occasion hear stories about what happened at some of the residential schools, or you hear the discovery of large grave sites, for example, at some of the residential schools. And when I say residential schools, I mean the ones in Canada, just to be clear. Yeah. So.
There was also a discussion of increasing contemporary media representations of the boarding schools. A couple people mentioned 1923, which is the Yellowstone prequel.
Oh, right. There are quite a few feature-length films about the boarding school experience, actually. Um, and I could give you a list of them when we're done, if you want. I don't know, are you all able to watch a feature-length film? Do you have the time to incorporate that into a curriculum? Maybe? Okay. We can watch clips of the film. Okay, okay. Um, so yeah, I can give you a list of a couple that that I think are really good. Actually, I almost shared this clip with not a clip, but this short film with you, but I wasn't entirely sure that it would be appropriate for a high school audience. It might be. I'll add it to the list, but it's actually set in a school on a reservation, um, and um, one of the teachers is played by Lily Gladstone, who was just nominated for an Academy Award for her work in Killers of the Flower Moon. Um, she was also in the great series Reservation Dogs as well. But it's about 6, 7, or 8 minutes, and it's about the difficulty of educating students in a very precarious community, right? In a very poor community, too. So, um, in any case, I'll put that on the list as well, because it's actually there's there's a chronology here, right? Of the federal boarding schools, um, the schools that are not really under the control of the Native community. And then post civil rights movement, there are not only schools more under the control of Native communities, but there are also tribal colleges as well. Um, and of course, the curriculums in those schools are much more Native focused, Indigenous focused, tribal nation specifically focused, right? Like, so if it's in a Dakota community, the focus is Dakota. If there's an Indigenous language being taught, it's Dakota, right? That sort of thing. But those schools, similarly to many schools across the country, are not well funded as well. So it makes education in those contexts a challenge in more ways. So, all right, how are we doing? Are we caught up on the chat, Elizabeth?
Pretty much,
Yeah,
yes. Mhm.
pretty much, pretty much. Okay, okay, very good. Thank you for all of your questions. And before I forget, actually, what I just promised you, I'm gonna write it down really quickly too. Okay. Um, so let's see. So the other two texts that I recommended we take a moment to talk about are the short story by Eddie Chocolate called Galveston Bay 1826, and then The Man to Send Rain Clouds by Leslie Marmon Silko. So I'll just say something about them and why I chose them. And then in the time that we have left, I'm happy to talk about them specifically, or just have a general conversation about the topic. So um, I chose short stories, obviously, because they're short. That's one thing. I do that for my own students, right? You sort of judge what your students are going to read, and you try to go take them a little farther than you think they might want to go. So I teach novels a lot too. So I try to be sure to include when I'm doing that, to include poems and short stories and that sort of thing to give them a little bit of a break. It's set in Texas, even better. You all are teachers in Texas, um, and it's one of those stories uh, in which all of the characters are indigenous. So, most of contemporary Native American literature, occurs in a very multi-ethnic and multiracial world, right? But there's a small set of stories, novels too, which are set either before contact, or set in a world that is exclusively indigenous. And this is one of those stories. And so it's a tremendous act of the imagination that Chocolate did this. Imagined 1820s Texas. There are already other people here at the time, um, but he imagines this group of Cheyennes who have heard about a great body of water, the Gulf of Mexico, and they've never seen it and they want to see it. And so they ride to see it. They encounter a local indigenous population. They see way off, at one point in the story, they see way off in the distance a caravan, but that's the closest you get to the appearance of non-native people in the story, assuming they are not native, right? He doesn't even say, but nevertheless, I assume that they are. So you have these four friends who have gone out on an adventure. He even calls it at the beginning of the story joyriding. So he's really trying to humanize his native characters, right? They're set in the 19th century. He's trying not to romanticize them. They're just four guys on horses who have heard this story about this big body of water and they want to go see it. So they get on horses and then they meet what are to them a kind of odd group of people. And this is the author, reminding us that the obvious, all indigenous people are not alike, that they often encountered indigenous people much different than they are. There's even a big dance near the end of the story, and the Cheyennes are like, "What are they doing? Why are we dancing? What right? They're just why? Because they're different than they are, and they don't understand each other. They don't speak the same language. They don't have the same traditions. They don't have the same religion, et cetera. And then, the story ends tragically because a hurricane hits, and only one of the four survive, and it becomes a story when the one survivor, Old Bull, gets back to his community. So it's a story about an adventure that became a story. It's a story about an adventure that became an oral tradition, about a hurricane that hit Galveston too. So the descriptions of the landscape are just unbelievable. They're really beautiful. It's just really draws you into the part of Texas that they're traveling through, and you get a character's eye view of the coastal shallows, and then their first view of the Gulf of Mexico too. So it's like it has all the elements of a great short story. I'm saying, right? Surprise and wonder and inspiration, and also a little bit of tragedy, at the end as well. But it becomes a legend too. So my students tend to absolutely love this story, and of course they always want more, and I tell them there aren't very many more, right? Like it's a little bit anomalous too, but all the more reason to teach it. And then the story by Silko, before she was Silko, The Man Descend Rain Clouds, is a story about the very, very uneasy relationship between Catholicism and indigenous religions in the Southwest. That's I think the best way, or the most clear way to summarize it. An older gentleman, Teofilo, dies. His friends find him. They don't want to tell the priest because they want to do the burial rites, the funeral rites themselves. They want to paint his face. They want to spread some corn pollen. And then finally, one of them feels guilty and goes and gets the priest. And the priest is a little angry with them, but then ends up coming anyway. And so that's the whole extent of the story. And I think that students appreciate the way that Silko shows this without judging any of it, right? She just says, this is what it's like to live in, set in about the middle of the 20th century, to live in a rural Native community that has had the influence of the influence of Catholicism, for 300 or more years, where most communities would identify as Catholic, but would also still um, practice some of their indigenous religious ceremonies and so on. And so it does a really good job just showing what that's like, showing what it's like to live in a community that has, it looks like from the outside, a coherent identity, specifically a coherent religious one, but on the inside, she shows, all the cracks and fissures in that particular identity. So someone's asking about the story, I think. Author's name. Oh yeah, I thought it. Okay, good. Yeah, it's in Google Classroom. The author's name is Leslie Marmon Silko, but she published it under Leslie Chapman. She was a very, very young writer when she published it, and her name, she took a different name later, later in life. The date I think is 1968, actually. So she went on to write probably one of the two most famous novels by a Native writer. It's called Ceremony. The other one is Housemaid of Dawn by N. Scott Momaday. So I will say that, oh, you're welcome, Lisa. Or I don't know if you might not be thanking me, but in any case, I saw that pop up. Anyway, one thing that I was talking to Elizabeth about briefly before our session started was that there's a lot of poetry online now on YouTube, and I mean, native poets reading their work. And one of the poems that I happened to run across that fits really well with this short story is by Simon Ortiz. And I was already imagining doing this myself, but the next time I taught The Man to Send Rain Clouds, I would teach this Simon Ortiz poem and show my students him reading it to an audience. It's called the Poetry Center, and they just I don't know when this happened. I missed it, but they have uploaded a lot of their archives to YouTube, and one of them is Simon Ortiz reading this poem called A San Diego Poem, and it's the feel of it and the content of it is very similar to what Silko evokes in The Man to Send Rain Clouds. So they're texts that go really well together. So I look forward to teaching them. I'll send that to you also, or send it to Elizabeth and Emily too. I'm trying to figure out how it got to be 11 after 6 already, because I feel like we just started. Any questions? Comments? And also, Elizabeth, I will cede back to you as well if you have some announcements you need to make.
We definitely have time for questions or comments from anybody.
Okay.
I have a question. For the Native Americans who went to these boarding schools, and I don't know if they would graduate from them or something. Was it common for them to go back to their communities, or did they stay assimilated in white society?
Great question. Any possible outcome that you can imagine happened. So, and it in part it depended on how long they stayed, how long they were separated from their family, whether or not they could speak their native language anymore when they went back to their homes, because that happened. Students would be gone for 7 years or more, and return, and they hadn't spoken, Muskogee, or they hadn't spoken Apache or Cheyenne or Kiowa, and they couldn't talk to their older relatives any longer, unless they spent years then relearning the language. Um, there wasn't really a system set up. This won't surprise you. There wasn't really a system set up to help them after they graduated, right? So, and the curriculum itself um, didn't easily translate to life outside the boarding schools. So some, like Gertrude Bonin and Charles Alexander Eastman, figured out how to make the education they received at the boarding schools work for them. They became writers and they became political activists. And they tried to figure out a way to learn to use their talents to help Native people, both in their home communities and across the country. Both of them were involved in an organization called the Society of American Indians, which was an intertribal group founded in 1911, and that was comprised originally of primarily boarding school graduates. Many other students tried to go back to their reservations. Those, for the most part, particularly at the time we're talking about, were very isolated. There wasn't a lot of economic opportunity for them back then. And they faced all kinds of challenges. Sometimes the community members who didn't go were suspicious of them. Sometimes if they tried to readopt their native traditions, they were condemned by the person, the federal overseer of the reservations, the Indian agent they were called. There was a slur used against those Native people who tried to adopt their Native traditions after going to the boarding schools. It was called going back to the blanket. And this was a term meant to insult someone who had gone to the schools and come back and thought, you know what, I liked it better before I went to the schools. And so that's a term that you'll see if you're reading any other literature about boarding schools. You'll probably encounter that expression, and it's meant to demean people. So Shauna, anything you can imagine happened. Sometimes they were hired out locally as domestic labor. That happened a lot, too. They weren't really, for the most part, prepared for life after the boarding schools. It's fair to say.
We have two questions that I
Okay.
think we can get to, or I hope we can. Wanda has asked, as you taught your students, what artifacts did you have them produce? What was your learning target? And Wanda, I'm not sure if you're including assignments, essays, or just what you're interested in the classroom there.
And where is what? And tell me what you mean by artifacts, please.
Well,
Too.
yeah, I was asking what did you have them ultimately do with all this knowledge and information that you've imparted in them?
So it's changed over the years. I mean, in some cases, they're writing historically and culturally formed short essays on a topic that they've encountered in the native lit that we've read, that they're really interested in and want to pursue. So it's kind of independent inquiry, independent research that I help them with, by providing them with sources. In most cases, I ask that it has its origins in the work that we've read, right? So they can point to something that's happening in one of the short stories or poems or novels that we've read and said, I really want to know more about this aspect of, say, Ojibwe religion. And I say, okay, let's do that. And then when I have the time, which I try to make the time now in all of my classes, I have them present to the class so that it becomes, if you have 25 students in your class, you have 25 different research projects all on something else, and they're all sharing all their knowledge, with their students. So the other thing that I've started to ask them to do is to do sort of non-conventional projects that involve media sometimes social media. You know, I have allowed them to um, uh, write scenes for film based on one of the novels that we've read. I give them templates so they can make it look like an actual screenplay that you'd submit to an agent in Hollywood. I ask them to cast it, to choose a director, choose a producer if they want. I've had them do various kinds of art, photography, uh, and I had a student who went down the rabbit hole looking at online databases with those stock photos that you can buy, right? And she collected 50 or 75 images of Native people, and she took what we had learned in the class and and gave a kind of a critical presentation on them to the class, right? So because we talk about representation a lot when we're in a literature class, right? Like how is this author, you know, representing Native women or Native children or whatever it is, you know, and so that's a really quick answer to your question. I have a much longer answer, but really it's gone from what we think of as more traditional kind of essays or short writing assignments that involve some additional research beyond the primary text we're using, all the way up, to, you know, to you know, letting them do something you know, much more, well, they say creative. That's how they would put it, right? Letting them do something more creative. But I've noticed that they're just really responsive to it. I had a student do a playlist for for 8 pieces of native writing that we read in one of the units, and he chose 3 songs for each work. Sometimes the songs appeared in the work, and sometimes it was just a song that he had connected to it. And when he did the presentation, it was just really well received. And I will say, we're all teachers here, so I can say what I'm going to say next. Those are much harder to grade, by the way. Those are much harder to grade, you know, than a more conventional or traditional essay. But in the end, I think it's worth it for them. So, literature about Native after leaving graduate. Okay, I see that, Lisa. I see the suggestion. I'll add that to the list that I have right here.
And Ashley, and this will be the last question because I know we're at time, but what are your suggestions for how teachers can push for more time and focus on Native American literature and history? I want schools and communities to understand the importance and value of students engaging in these discussions and all of this wonderful learning. So good note to end on.
It's always the question, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I've done it at a couple different places at the university level. And I mean, you just have to convince people that it's important and that the history is important, and that you know, everyone is living in some version of Indigenous America. Everybody. We all are. You know, and so if I was going to try to convince someone, say at your school or in your school district, to do it, I would start locally, right? I would try to learn what I could about, you know, about the local Indigenous history or regional Indigenous history, maybe, you know, and you know, try to make a case to your whoever makes those decisions, your administrators, your school boards, whatever, you know, that this in fact is the real world in which people are living. It's a world produced by the clash, often tragic, of 2 huge human populations. And we still live the product of that clash today, every day. We do. We live on the land. You know, we eat the food that's indigenous to this world. We all know words in indigenous languages. We use them all the time. You know, when we're every time you eat a tomato, right? We call that word, I mean, we call that fruit, that word bee, that's the indigenous word, one of the indigenous words for it, right? I mean, and chocolate for that matter, right? But I'm just saying that that's going a little bit into too much detail, but I'm just saying that like, that's like that world has is the one we live in. We're shaped by it. You know, our culture is shaped by it. Our history was shaped by it. Our politics are shaped by it on a daily basis. So, if anyone wants to talk about that more, you're welcome to email me. I can spend a little bit more time giving you suggestions about how you might do it, and maybe even some texts that you could read that would help you do it. Right, that texts that talk about the importance of knowing Native history in particular. That includes, to my mind, Native literature, Native storytelling traditions too. So I could make those suggestions as well if you wanted to.
All right. Well, that is all we have time for. We want to give a hearty and enthusiastic
Mhm.
thank you to Dr. Cox for being such a great presenter and these two wide-ranging and immensely helpful sessions. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for your engagement and your curiosity and for joining us, and of course for the work with your students. And we wish you a happy end of the semester.